You think corporate murder requires poison? It just takes a biting Chicago winter night, a stolen blueprint, and the moment my boss decided a maintenance worker did not deserve human decency, the elite think they are playing chess, forgetting the people who clean the board know its every crack. Listen closely. The price of this arrogance is not just $200 million, but the total collapse of a fake empire. Hello and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. I want to sincerely thank each and every one of you for your continued support, but unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep running, which means we will soon have to stop publishing new public videos here. If you enjoyed today's story and want to help us survive, please consider joining our Patreon, where you will find even better, longer, and incredibly detailed exclusive true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot share on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description or pinned comment. Now, let us dive right into today's story, where I, Chloe Lawson, will show you exactly how a corporate empire crumbles. I am 29 years old, and for the past 4 years, I have been a structural engineer at Vanguard Horizon, a colossal urban development conglomerate that prides itself on changing city skylines. That is what the shiny corporate brochures say. Anyway, the reality behind the heavy glass doors is much less glamorous and far more ruthless. For 4 long years, I have been the invisible brain behind every major flagship project this company has ever launched. I am the one who does the grueling math, the one who makes sure the gravity-defying glass structures do not collapse and crush the wealthy elites who drink vintage champagne underneath them. My boss, Vanessa Sterling, is a completely different story entirely. She is our esteemed creative director, a woman who secured her executive position entirely through old money, country club handshakes, and powerful family connections. If you look at the glossy architectural magazines displayed in our pristine lobby, you will invariably see her heavily airbrushed face plastered across the covers. The glowing articles constantly call her the architectural Iron Lady of the modern age. They relentlessly praise her bold vision, her disruptive genius, and her fearless approach to urban design. It is a brilliantly funded public relations machine. In brutal truth, Vanessa could not independently calculate the load-bearing capacity of a standard wooden staircase if her very life depended on it. She memorizes the names of expensive Italian marbles and knows exactly how to wear designer power suits. But she treats the unbreakable laws of physics like they are merely optional suggestions. Our current obsession at Vanguard Horizon is a monumental project called the Obsidian. It is a massive, sprawling commercial and residential complex with an astronomical budget of $200 million. We are currently in the final, agonizing stage of the bidding process. The entire project is being funded by an anonymous tech billionaire who operates through a maze of shell companies and demands absolute perfection. The pressure inside our office is utterly suffocating. The central air conditioning is always set too cold. The fluorescent lights buzz with a headache-inducing hum, and every single employee walks around looking like they are one angry email away from a complete nervous breakdown. About a month ago, while running a routine digital stress simulation on the architectural drafts, I noticed something profoundly horrifying. There was a fatal flaw buried deep within the foundation structure of the Obsidian. If built according to the original, flashy aesthetic design that Vanessa had hastily approved, the shifting soil near the riverbank would eventually compromise the core structural integrity. It would not happen immediately, but in 10 or 15 years, the entire building would begin to crack and tilt. I spent 14 consecutive sleepless nights desperately fixing it. I practically lived in my dark cubicle, surviving on stale cafeteria coffee and sheer adrenaline, carefully rewriting the structural algorithms, adjusting the concrete density metrics, and completely redesigning the sub-level support system. I single-handedly saved Vanguard Horizon from a catastrophic future failure that would have ended in endless criminal lawsuits and ruined lives. When I finally submitted the meticulously corrected blueprints, exhausted but intensely proud of the rigorous engineering work, I expected at least a brief nod of professional acknowledgement. Instead, I received a masterclass in shameless corporate theft. The very next morning, the updated files were widely circulated to the executive board of directors. I opened the master file, and my stomach dropped. Vanessa had blatantly deleted my name from the entire document, where it should have clearly stated lead structural engineer Chloe Lawson. It now proudly displayed Vanessa Sterling in a sleek, customized font. During the final preparatory meeting later that week, I sat quietly at the far end of the long mahogany conference table, waiting for the perfect moment to bring up the missing accreditation. I never got the chance. Before the board members arrived, Vanessa stood at the head of the table, delicately sipping her artisanal green juice, and looked down at me with a toxic mixture of pity and disgust. "Chloe, I need you to sit out the final pitch tomorrow," she said, her voice dripping with fake, manufactured sweetness. I looked up from my laptop, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I am the exact only person in this building who fully understands the new foundation algorithms. If the client asks highly technical questions, you will absolutely need me in that room." Vanessa laughed, a sharp grating sound that made my teeth ache. "Let us be completely honest with ourselves. You are just a CAD typing machine. You do the invisible background typing, and I do the actual selling. Plus, your interface is way too gloomy. You look like you have not slept in an entire month, and your wardrobe is frankly depressing. It is just not suitable for VIP clients. We need to project absolute power and luxury, not basement-dwelling desperation." The silence in the conference room was incredibly heavy. The junior designers quickly looked down at their notebooks, terrified to make even a second of eye contact with either of us. A normal person might have yelled. A normal person might have thrown their hot coffee across the room or marched straight into human resources to file a formal, documented complaint. I did not fight back. I did not say a single, angry word. I simply closed my laptop, nodded once, and calmly walked back to my desk. I knew a fundamental truth that Vanessa, blinded by all her money and arrogance, did not understand. A massive building does not fall because you scream at it. It falls because you quietly remove its structural support. Over the next few hours, I sat in my gloomy little cubicle and began to meticulously work. I silently archived every single original blueprint variation. I meticulously saved every line of my calculation code, every digital structural model, and every absurd, technically impossible email Vanessa had ever sent me. I packed 4 years of stolen intellectual property and undeniable proof of her sheer incompetence into a deeply encrypted external hard drive. I locked it all away with a cryptographic key only I possessed. I was not angry anymore. I was simply preparing the demolition charges. The night before the monumental $200 million presentation, Chicago decided to unleash a winter storm that felt less like weather and more like a physical assault. The wind howled through the concrete canyons of the financial district, driving horizontal sheets of ice that battered the towering skyscrapers. Inside the grand lobby of Vanguard Horizon, the temperature was usually perfectly regulated to a comfortable 72 degrees. Tonight, however, the majestic, double-height revolving doors, massive slabs of custom-tempered architectural glass, were losing a brutal war against the gale-force winds. I was making my way down to the ground floor, my arms burning as I carried a towering stack of physical architectural modeling documents. The digital files were secure, but protocol demanded heavy, physical backups for the client review. As the elevator doors chimed and slid open on the lobby level, a blast of freezing air hit me so hard it stole the breath directly from my lungs. The primary revolving door had jammed. Worse, the sheer pressure of the storm had caused one of the monumental glass panes to spiderweb with dangerous, jagged cracks. The structural integrity was failing rapidly, and the frigid winter wind was violently pouring into the immaculate marble lobby. Right in the center of this chaos stood a man. He wore a faded, heavy-duty canvas maintenance uniform that looked 10 years out of date. He was older, his face lined and weathered, but what immediately caught my eye was the blood. His bare hands were scraped and bleeding profusely as he desperately wedged his own body weight and a thick metal pry bar against the buckling aluminum frame. trying to prevent the massive pain of fractured glass from completely giving way and shattering inward. The heavy glass groaned, a terrifying, deep acoustic vibration that signaled imminent collapse. Before I could even drop my boxes, the private VIP elevator directly across the lobby illuminated with a soft golden glow. The doors parted, and Vanessa stepped out. She was wrapped in an absurdly oversized, pristine white fox fur coat, holding an expensive leather designer handbag. She stopped dead in her tracks, but not out of concern for the man risking his life to hold the door. Her face twisted into a mask of absolute revulsion. "What on earth is happening here?" she demanded, her shrill voice echoing over the howling wind. "You are bleeding all over the imported Italian marble. Do you have any idea how much it costs to polish these floors? This is an absolute aesthetic disaster. We have a $200 million client arriving in exactly 14 hours, and the lobby looks like a slaughterhouse. Clean this up immediately and get out of sight." The old maintenance worker did not say a single word. He could not. His jaw was clenched in sheer agony, his boot slipping slightly on his own blood as the wind battered the glass pane from the outside. Vanessa simply rolled her eyes in profound annoyance, pulled her fur collar up around her neck, and carefully stepped around the struggling man, making sure the hem of her designer coat did not brush against his dirty uniform. She pushed through the secondary side exit, slipping into the heated interior of her waiting black town car. The sheer audacity of her cruelty snapped me out of my shock. I did not hesitate. I unceremoniously dumped the heavy stack of modeling documents straight onto the pristine marble floor, the carefully bound pages scattering everywhere. I sprinted toward the violently shaking doorframe. The man was losing his grip. The metal pry bar was slipping because the angle of leverage was entirely wrong. It was a basic physics problem playing out in terrifying real time. "Hold it steady for exactly 3 seconds," I shouted over the roaring wind. I rapidly unbuckled my heavy leather belt, yanking it free from my trousers. Wrapping the thick leather firmly around the base of the buckling aluminum mullion, I created a makeshift tension strap. I threaded the pry bar through the leather loop, entirely shifting the fulcrum point. "Now," I yelled, "push down on the bar. Do not push against the glass." We threw our combined weight onto the makeshift lever. The physics immediately shifted. The leather snapped taut, transferring our downward force into lateral pressure that perfectly countered the wind. With a harsh metallic screech, the frame snapped back into its track, instantly locking the fractured glass pane safely in place. The biting wind was immediately cut off, leaving the lobby in a sudden, eerie silence. I sank to the marble floor, gasping for air, my chest heaving. I looked down and realized the sharp edges of the aluminum track had sliced open the palms of both my hands. They were stinging fiercely, small trails of bright red mixing with the dirt and grease on my skin. Beside me, the old maintenance worker slowly sat down on his heels. He was breathing heavily, wiping a mixture of sweat and melting ice from his forehead. He looked at the locked door mechanism, then turned his sharp, calculating eyes toward me. "The sheer stress on that aluminum track," he said, his voice surprisingly deep and calm for a man who had just narrowly avoided being crushed. "Why did you shift the fulcrum to the base instead of the midpoint? Most people would push the center." I blinked, genuinely caught off guard by the highly specific technical question coming from a building janitor. Despite the exhaustion and the stinging cuts on my hands, my engineering brain automatically engaged. "Because the midpoint was already compromised by the wind pressure," I explained, leaning back against the cold marble. "If we applied counterforce to the center, the tempered glass would have shattered under the conflicting tension. By shifting the fulcrum to the base, we utilize the structural root of the frame. It is the exact same principle as reinforcing a foundation before you try to brace the walls. You always secure the lowest anchor point first." The old man listened intently, a very faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth. He reached into the deep pocket of his faded canvas jacket and pulled out a flawlessly folded, pristine white linen handkerchief. It was an incredibly expensive, high thread count fabric, completely incongruous with his worn-out blue-collar uniform. He carefully handed it to me, gesturing toward my bleeding palms. "You see right through things that are about to collapse," he said softly. Before I could ask him what he meant, or how he knew so much about structural shear stress, the building security guards finally rushed into the lobby. In the ensuing commotion of securing the area and calling for facility backup, the old man quietly slipped away. The next morning, precisely at 8 o'clock, my computer pinged with a high-priority email notification. It was from Vanessa. She had copied the entire Human Resources Department on the message. The text was short, cold, and dripping with corporate venom. "Chloe, your sloppy attire and highly unprofessional behavior in the main lobby last night were completely unacceptable. You were seen rolling around on the floor with the maintenance staff, leaving a mess of documents scattered everywhere. This lack of decorum is exactly why you are strictly forbidden from appearing on the executive floor today. Stay in the basement. Do not ruin this pitch." I read the email twice. I looked at the neatly folded, blood-stained linen handkerchief resting next to my keyboard. Then, I quietly closed the email, my resolve hardening like poured concrete. The storm outside had passed, but the real demolition was just about to begin. The sub-basement server room was a sensory deprivation chamber. There were no windows, only the aggressive, relentless hum of massive cooling fans and the endless rows of blinking green lights on the server racks. I was exiled down here, instructed to provide remote tech support just in case the three-dimensional rendering software crashed during the presentation. My only connection to the 50th floor was a muted, high-definition security feed displayed across my dual monitors. I sat in a hard plastic chair, the fresh bandages on my hands stinging under the sterile fluorescent glare, watching my stolen legacy being paraded in front of the board of directors. Vanessa commanded the room as if she were a theater actress on opening night. She wore a bespoke crimson suit, tailored to an absolute millimeter of perfection, stalking back and forth across the front of the massive mahogany table. Even without audio, I could read her body language perfectly. She was aggressively deploying her usual arsenal of empty corporate buzzwords. Her lips moved, and I knew exactly what she was saying. Synergistic urban integration, disruptive spatial dynamics, holistic ecosystem structuring. She waved her silver laser pointer over the projected blueprints like a magic wand, desperately trying to distract everyone from the actual math. The executives from Vanguard Horizon nodded along, utterly hypnotized by her manufactured confidence. 10 minutes past the hour, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. The room instantly froze. The VIP client had finally arrived. There was no entourage, there were no frantic secretaries carrying briefcases, and there was absolutely no bespoke Italian suit. The man who walked into the most important corporate meeting of the decade was wearing dark denim jeans, a faded black turtleneck, and heavy leather work boots. He moved with a quiet, dangerous grace. I leaned closer to my monitor, my breath catching in my throat. It was him. It was the maintenance worker from the lobby. The man whose life I had helped save just a few hours prior was none other than Elias Thorne, a notoriously reclusive, self-made tech billionaire whose methods for testing potential business partners were legendary for their extreme psychological cruelty. Vanessa did not recognize him at all. To her, a person was only visible if they wore a certain brand or carried a specific title. She paused her presentation, her face tightening with barely concealed irritation at the interruption. Clearly assuming this man was merely some eccentric technical advisor sent ahead by the real billionaire, she offered a tight, condescending smile, gesturing toward an empty chair at the far end of the table. Elias Thorne ignored the chair entirely. He walked slowly around the perimeter of the room. His eyes locked onto the glowing projection screen displaying the complex structural foundation of the obsidian. Unfazed by his cold silence, Vanessa decided to double down on her performance. She proudly tapped the screen, pointing directly at the reinforced sub-level support system, the exact foundation algorithm I had spent 14 sleepless nights desperately rewriting to save the building from future collapse. She smiled radiantly, taking full and absolute credit for the genius of the engineering, claiming it was her own unique vision that solved the shifting soil problem near the riverbank. Elias stopped pacing. The atmosphere in the room shifted so violently, I could feel the suffocating tension all the way down in the basement. He stepped directly into the beam of the projector, letting the complex lines of the blueprint wash across his face. He raised a single finger and pointed at a highly specific structural joint on the digital schematic. I turned on the room audio feed, just in time to hear his voice cut through the silence like a serrated blade. "Explain the shear stress counterforce at this exact sub-level juncture," Elias demanded, his voice low, gravelly, and echoing off the glass walls. "Why did you shift the fulcrum tension to the base anchor instead of bracing the midpoint? Most people would push the center." It was the exact same physics question he had asked me in the freezing lobby. Vanessa completely froze. The laser pointer in her hand began to tremble, the tiny red dot dancing erratically across the white screen. The blood rapidly drained from her face, leaving her pale and terrified beneath her expensive makeup. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The entire board of directors turned to stare at her, the silence stretching into an excruciating eternity. "Well," Elias pressed, taking one step closer to her, "it is your visionary design, Ms. Sterling. Explain the basic physics of your own foundation." Panic completely rewired Vanessa's brain. She started stammering, frantically stringing together random, meaningless numbers and architectural terms. She babbled about concrete density ratios that were completely irrelevant and tried to bring up aesthetic load distribution, which did not even exist as a real engineering concept. Every word leaving her mouth dug her grave a little deeper. She was publicly, undeniably proving that she possessed absolutely no comprehension of the blueprints bearing her stolen signature. The Vanguard Horizon CEO shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead as he realized the $200 million deal was evaporating before his eyes. Elias Thorne did not shout. He did not lose his temper. He simply reached out, picked up the glossy presentation folder containing Vanessa's fraudulent portfolio, and calmly closed it. The sound of the thick cardboard snapping shut echoed like a gunshot over the audio feed. "I do not sign contracts with intellectual thieves who trample on others," Elias said, his voice a lethal, rumbling thunder that vibrated through the ceiling speakers down into my server room. He looked directly at the CEO of Vanguard Horizon, his eyes burning with absolute disgust. "Call the engineer with the fresh scar on her left hand up here, or this project dies this very second." The audio feed from the 50th floor did not just mute. The dual monitors in front of me violently flickered, emitted a sharp electronic hiss, and then died completely. A chilling, absolute blackness swallowed the screens, reflecting only my own exhausted face in the dark glass. A split second later, the rhythmic blinking green lights on the towering server racks surrounding me shifted to a solid, angry red. My network connection had been physically severed from the mainframe. The corporate digital assassination had begun. I reached for my company-issued mobile phone resting on the desk, but before my fingers could even brush the cold metal casing, the screen illuminated with an urgent notification. It was a direct, automated text message from the Human Resources Department. The words were sterile, calculated, and legally weaponized. It informed me that I was effectively suspended pending a thorough internal investigation into a catastrophic data security breach. My corporate email account instantly wiped itself clean right before my eyes, reverting to a blank factory reset screen. Vanessa was trapped in a room with a furious billionaire, and her immediate survival instinct was to detonate everything in her path. I could vividly imagine the sheer, unadulterated panic completely rewiring her brain. She had clearly sprinted out of that boardroom, bypassed standard protocols, and utilized her absolute executive administrator privileges to initiate a brutal, scorched earth smear campaign. She was desperate to control the narrative before Elias Thorne could dismantle her completely. Through my isolated terminal, before the final hardware firewall slammed shut, I caught a fleeting glimpse of the system logs actively altering, Vanessa was frantically restoring the original, fatally flawed foundation blueprints back into the primary project folder. She was systematically deleting the meticulous version history, intentionally scrubbing away my 14 nights of grueling mathematical corrections. Her sinister strategy was horrifyingly clear. She was actively framing me as a disgruntled, rogue engineer who had deliberately planted a structural time bomb to sabotage the entire $200 million project. But a simple technical error was not enough to protect her fragile ego. She needed to destroy my character completely. I knew the corporate playbook. By now, she was undoubtedly flooding the executive communications channels with heavily fabricated reports and forged email chains. She would paint a tragic, alarming picture of a lower-level employee suffering from severe mental instability. She would claim I had developed acute paranoia and an unhealthy, dangerous obsession with our high-profile clients. She was transforming me from a brilliant structural engineer into a volatile security threat who had leaked proprietary information to rival development firms. It was a masterclass in psychological projection and character assassination. I stood up slowly, the silence in the sub-basement feeling heavier than solid concrete. I walked over to the heavy steel door and swiped my employee identification badge against the scanner. A harsh, buzzing rejection tone echoed through the corridor. The indicator light flashed a brilliant red. My access was entirely revoked. I was officially a ghost inside the machine I had spent 4 years building. Less than 3 minutes later, the heavy mechanical lock clicked open from the outside. 2 massive security guards stepped into the server room. Their hands hovered nervously near their utility belts, their postures rigid and defensive. They had clearly been briefed that they were dealing with a highly unstable, potentially dangerous saboteur who might lash out violently. I did not give them the satisfaction of a breakdown. I did not scream about the staggering injustice of it all. I did not desperately plead my case or demand to speak to the chief executive officer. I simply picked up my woolen winter coat, smoothed out the wrinkles in my trousers, and walked toward them with my head held high. The forced march out of the Vanguard Horizon building was a surreal experience. We walked through the long, brightly lit corridors of the lower levels, stepping into the main lobby where the cracked revolving door was now cordoned off with yellow caution tape. The freezing Chicago wind was still howling outside, whipping the fresh snow into blinding white cyclones. The guards flanked me tightly, escorting me right to the very edge of the corporate property line as if I were a convicted criminal. Before I stepped out into the freezing winter storm, the senior guard held out his hand, his face completely devoid of any human empathy. He demanded my security badge. I unclipped the plastic lanyard from my belt. I looked him dead in the eyes, handing over the useless piece of plastic. As I did, a slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of defeat. It was a smile of absolute, terrifying certainty. The guard physically recoiled, taking a small, involuntary step backward. He shivered, and I knew it was not from the biting winter wind blowing through the broken glass. I walked alone through the heavy snow, the icy flakes melting against my flushed cheeks. I finally reached the quiet sanctuary of my small apartment, shaking off the winter chill. I brewed a cup of dark tea, sat down at my personal desktop computer, and reached into the hidden compartment of my leather satchel. I pulled out a small, heavy metal USB drive. It did not just contain a simple copy of the project, it held an independent, self-verifying cloud backup, rigorously protected by an unbreakable blockchain encryption algorithm. Every single keystroke, every deleted file, and every frantic modification Vanessa had just made on the corporate servers was permanently recorded and verified on an immutable digital ledger. I plugged the drive into the glowing port. As the decryption software hummed to life, I took a slow sip of my tea. Vanessa thought she had successfully buried me alive, completely unaware that she had just spent the last hour digging a grave for herself that she could never, ever escape. The executive suites of Vanguard Horizon were descending into a state of absolute, unmanageable pandemonium. The chief executive officer spent the entire morning barricaded in his corner office, desperately dialing Elias Thorne's private secure number. leaving increasingly frantic voicemails that echoed with corporate terror. Every single call went straight to a dead, silent void. Finally, right before the lunch hour, a brief, single-sentence message arrived through a heavily encrypted channel from Thorne's executive assistant. It was not an invitation for a diplomatic dialogue. It was a ruthless execution order. In exactly 36 hours, I expect to see the final architectural bid presented in person by the actual engineer who mathematically authored the design, or I will immediately purchase your largest competitor, fund them with $200 million, and ensure Vanguard Horizon never wins another bid in this city. The panic accelerated into sheer terror. The corporate legal department, sensing a catastrophic, company-ending liability, launched an aggressive forensic audit of the internal network. The head of legal compliance and the chief technology officer bypassed Vanessa entirely and began frantically digging through the digital server wreckage she had left behind. They quickly discovered glaring, terrifying anomalies. The background metadata on the supposedly original computer-aided design files did not match the creation dates. There were massive, unexplainable gaps in the digital footprint, missing render logs, and phantom file extensions that proved someone with executive administrator privileges had violently tampered with the system architecture. The legal team knew a massive fraud had occurred, but knowing a crime happened and proving it in court are two entirely different things. The crucial truth, the original data, was locked tightly behind my independent blockchain encryption algorithm. Vanguard Horizon possessed the locked digital safe, but they had absolutely no idea how to forge the key. Meanwhile, miles away from the corporate hysteria, my small apartment was a sanctuary of absolute, calculated silence. I was sitting quietly at my kitchen island, calmly watching the heavy snow continue to fall over the gray city skyline. When a sharp, authoritative knock echoed from my front door, I opened it to find a private courier, brushing snow from his shoulders, holding a sleek, unbranded black velvet box. There was no return address, no shipping manifest. I carried it to the living room table and carefully lifted the heavy lid. Resting inside on a bed of dark, luxurious silk was a brand new, incredibly expensive designer leather belt. It was a silent, perfect replacement for the one I had sacrificed to secure the shattered lobby door the night before. Tucked neatly beneath the heavy silver buckle was a thick cream-colored cardstock note. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, and written in dark fountain pen ink. Good structures always withstand pressure. Do not collapse. It was signed with simply two initials, E.T. A slow, genuine smile touched my lips. The heavy weight in my chest finally evaporated. I was not fighting this massive corporate war alone against an army of lawyers. The billionaire client had just quietly handed me the ultimate loaded weapon and granted me permission to fire it. I walked over to my desk, my fingers hovering over the mechanical keyboard. It was time to pull the trigger and end this charade. I opened a secure, untraceable offshore email client. I did not bother sending anything to Vanessa or my immediate department heads. They were merely pawns. I addressed the message directly to the Chief Executive Officer and the Global Director of Legal Affairs. I attached a single, massively compressed portable document format file. It was exactly 2 gigabytes of pure, unadulterated corporate destruction. This dossier was a masterpiece of forensic vengeance. It contained the absolute, irrefutable truth that Vanessa had tried to bury. I included the comprehensive keystroke history for every single line of code in the structural algorithms. I provided the exact timestamps of every vector drawn in the architectural modeling software, cross-referenced perfectly with my personal terminal login hours from the basement. I attached high-resolution screenshots of every single absurd, technically illiterate email Vanessa had ever sent me, documenting her demanding impossible geometric shapes and completely ignoring basic laws of gravity, but I did not stop at the digital paperwork. During my final hour in the server room, right before the network cut off, I had quietly extracted a specific file from the internal security mainframe. I embedded the raw, unedited, high-definition video feed from the lobby camera. It showed, in crystal clear quality, Exactly how Vanessa had sneered and walked away from a bleeding man holding a shattering glass wall. A character assassination, however, was not my ultimate goal. I needed to ensure Vanessa could never touch another blueprint, at any firm, as long as she lived. The final page of the dossier was the fatal blow. I attached a rigorous, peer-reviewed mathematical algorithm, clearly demonstrating the devastating physical consequences of the fake blueprints she had just restored to the central server. The math proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that if the obsidian was actually constructed using her hastily covered-up foundation plans, the massive structure would buckle and completely collapse within a decade. I meticulously detailed the projected mass casualty reports. I translated the engineering failure into stark, terrifying legal terminology. I made it absolutely clear to the Vanguard executives that proceeding with Vanessa's stolen design was no longer a simple internal dispute over intellectual property rights. It was premeditated. Fully documented criminal negligence on a catastrophic scale. I typed a very brief subject line, "The Obsidian Foundation." I hit the enter key. I sat back in my leather chair and watched the green progress bar rapidly fill the screen. It took exactly 14 seconds for the massive file to transmit through the encrypted tunnel and land directly in the highest inboxes of Vanguard Horizon. The winter storm outside my window was finally beginning to clear, but inside the glass towers of my former company, the real hurricane was just making landfall. The emergency board meeting was convened precisely at 9 o'clock the following morning. The atmosphere inside the executive boardroom on the 50th floor was incredibly thick, heavy with the suffocating scent of corporate terror and stale espresso. Every single member of the board of directors was present, sitting rigidly in their high-backed leather chairs, their faces pale and drawn from a sleepless night of panic. At exactly 5 minutes past the hour, Vanessa Sterling made her grand entrance. She walked through the heavy mahogany doors with a sickeningly triumphant smile plastered across her face, radiating the false, arrogant confidence of a woman who genuinely believed she had successfully buried her only threat. She was dressed in a pristine, cream-colored designer suit, carrying a sleek silver tablet. In her twisted mind, I was already a forgotten ghost, permanently erased from the Vanguard Horizon servers and banished to the freezing Chicago streets. She had undoubtedly spent the previous night frantically purchasing a generic, hastily patched-together foundation design from an offshore freelance firm, fully intending to present it as her own miraculous overnight solution to save the massive project. She confidently strode to the head of the massive table, completely ignoring the terrified silence of the executives. She connected her tablet to the central console, ready to spin another web of beautiful, meaningless lies. She pressed the button to lower the massive projector screen and dim the overhead lights. She dramatically turned to face the board, flashing her signature, magazine cover smile. However, the screen behind her did not display her elegant title slide or her stolen architectural renderings. Instead, the massive digital canvas violently flashed a blinding, blood-red color that illuminated the darkened room. A heavy, bold text dominated the screen, originating directly from the internal legal compliance system. It read in massive white letters, "Warning, criminal risk detected, severe infraction, forged and fraudulent design architecture." Vanessa froze. The color instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face. She turned around to look at the screen, her mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish, utterly unable to comprehend the digital execution order glowing behind her. Before she could utter a single syllable of defense, the heavy double doors at the back of the boardroom swung open with a resounding, thunderous crash. The room collectively gasped, and several executives physically jumped in their seats. I walked into the boardroom, my posture perfectly straight, my head held high. I was no longer wearing my oversized, exhausted basement engineering clothes. I wore a sharp, charcoal gray bespoke suit, tailored flawlessly to my shoulders, secured perfectly by the brand-new, heavy leather designer belt Elias Thorne had sent me. I did not walk in alone. Flanking me on my right was the Global Director of Legal Affairs, clutching a printed copy of my 2-gigabyte dossier of absolute truth. Flanking me on my left, radiating an aura of lethal, quiet power, was the self-made billionaire himself, Elias Thorne. Vanessa stared at me as if I had just risen from the dead. Her eyes darted wildly between me, the head of legal, and the man she had so casually dismissed in the lobby just 2 nights prior. Elias did not wait for an introduction. He strode directly past the terrified executives, walked straight up to Vanessa, and slammed a thick printed copy of her fatally flawed architectural file violently onto the polished mahogany table. The sound echoed like a physical gunshot. "You were going to kill thousands of innocent people in my building with this patched-up, structurally incompetent design," Elias roared, his gravelly voice vibrating with a terrifying, barely contained fury. "You were going to let a massive glass and concrete structure collapse into the earth just to protect your fragile ego and to cover your tracks. You tried to fire the exact only person in this entire fraudulent company who actually knew how to keep it standing." Vanessa completely lost her mind. The polished, elegant veneer shattered into a million pathetic pieces. She started screaming, pointing a trembling, manic finger in my direction. "She is lying. She is a saboteur. She hacked the mainframe and altered the algorithms to frame me. She is mentally unstable. You cannot possibly believe a low-level drafting machine over your chief creative director." Her desperate slander echoed in the silent room, but nobody was listening anymore. The chief executive officer of Vanguard Horizons stood up from his chair, his face flushed with absolute rage and profound embarrassment. He did not even look at her when he delivered the final blow. "Shut your mouth, Vanessa," the CEO commanded, his voice cold and devoid of any previous affection or respect. "We have seen the unedited lobby security footage. We have read every single one of your mathematically illiterate emails. We have the immutable blockchain keystroke logs. You are not just fired, you are a massive criminal liability." He gestured sharply toward the door. The exact same 2 massive security guards who had escorted me out into the snowstorm the day before stepped into the room. "Confiscate her corporate mobile phone, take her security badge, and escort her off the premises immediately," the CEO ordered, "and contact our external litigation team. We are filing charges for gross commercial fraud and intellectual property theft by the end of the hour." The Iron Lady of Architecture finally broke. For the first time in her pampered, privileged life, Vanessa Sterling faced genuine, inescapable consequences. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the expensive imported carpet, her designer skirt bunching up around her as she began to sob hysterically. It was a loud, ugly, pitiful sound. She begged for a second chance, pleading with the executives who had previously worshipped her, but they all turned their heads away in silent disgust. The security guards grabbed her by the arms, unceremoniously hauling her up from the floor and dragging her out of the boardroom. Her frantic cries echoed down the hallway until the heavy doors finally clicked shut, sealing her fate forever. The silence that followed was heavy, but the suffocating tension had finally broken. Elias Thorne turned away from the door and slowly looked around the table at the remaining board members. He reached into his dark jacket and pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen. "I will sign this $200 million funding check right now, today, on one single, non-negotiable condition," Elias stated, his voice returning to that calm, dangerous baseline. "This monumental complex will still be named the Obsidian. However, on the very first foundation stone laid into the earth, and on every single official document submitted to the city, it must be permanently engraved with Chloe Lawson as the absolute, undisputed chief architect." The executives nodded frantically, a wave of desperate agreement washing over the room. They would have agreed to paint the entire building neon pink if it meant saving the massive financial deal. I walked slowly toward the head of the table. I looked down at the luxurious, high-backed leather executive chair that had belonged to Vanessa just 10 minutes ago. I did not sneer. I did not waste my breath throwing insults at the ghost of a defeated enemy. I simply pulled the chair out and sat down. The leather was still warm. I placed my personal laptop onto the table and smoothly flipped the screen open. I looked up, offering a calm, professional smile to Elias Thorne and the newly humbled board of directors. "So," I said softly, my voice carrying the absolute weight of a woman who had just conquered an empire, "shall we start rebuilding from the foundation?" Every single person in that room, the wealthy corporate elites who had spent 4 years completely ignoring my existence, now simultaneously bowed their heads in silent, absolute respect. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So please let me know your city or country down in the comments below. If you found today's journey of corporate justice satisfying, please help us keep this community alive by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon. There, you can listen to our very best, highly detailed, and incredibly immersive exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the QR code right here on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Your support means everything to us. Stay strong, and never let anyone take credit for your hard work.